My wife chose to go to the company gala dinner with her boss. She said it was an important occasion, that everyone would be there, that it would be good for her professional image. I just nodded, understandingly, but inside, something cracked. Because she hadn't asked me to go with her. She'd told me. A silent choice, without shouting, without fighting, without tears. And it was precisely this silence that screamed louder than any argument we'd ever had. It was as if the decision had already been made long before that night. She wore a dress I didn't recognize, makeup that didn't match her usual self, and a new perfume, one that wasn't for me. I watched the door slowly close behind her, feeling as if the house had become emptier than ever. The night passed slowly. No texts. No calls. Just the ticking of the clock and the sound of my own breathing trying to mask the tightness in my chest. And deep down, I already knew. I knew what was happening. Because when the person who says they love you chooses to shine for someone else, you understand that love has become a memory. I waited for her to return. Not out of naivety, but out of respect for what we once were. But the emptiness in the room had already answered me. That was the night everything changed. The next day, she returned like someone returning from the grocery store, without guilt, without explanation, just throwing her bag on the couch and saying it had been a long night. And I didn't ask anything. Because when the truth hurts too much, we choose silence to survive. But inside me, a silent revolution had already begun. She thought she could come and go. That she could have me there, unconditional, immobile, waiting. She didn't see the pieces she left behind, nor how much her absence forced me to find myself. The following days were a poorly rehearsed act. Cold kisses, empty conversations, forced laughter. She no longer looked into my eyes. And I no longer looked into hers. We slept together, but miles apart. We shared the same roof, but we lived in parallel worlds. I saw her phone turn face down frequently. I listened to the shower running longer than necessary. She distanced herself from her family, her old friends, everything that connected us to the past. As if she were trying to erase traces of a story that, for me, was still real. But the body speaks. And hers screamed. No confession was needed. The absences, the delays, the disguised smiles, everything pointed to someone else. The invisible lover was in every excuse, in every "I'm tired," in every lost glance. And still, I endured. Because loving someone is, sometimes, resisting one's own pride. I wanted to believe it was just a phase, a crisis, a stumble. But it wasn't. It was a choice. Deliberate. Cold. Calm. And that's what hurts the most, knowing the betrayal wasn't an accident, it was a decision. One day, while she was in the shower, her phone vibrated. I didn't want to see it. It wasn't my intention to intrude. But it was inevitable. The message was on the screen. Yesterday was unforgettable. When can we see each other again? No name. Just a heart at the end. I left the phone there, in the same place. When she came out of the bathroom, I simply said, "You can be happy with him." But away from me. She froze. The towel fell a little. Her eyes welled up. But there was no denial. No attempt to lie. Just an awkward silence. And that silence confirmed everything. She tried to talk in the following days. She said she didn't know what she was doing, that everything got confusing. That I wasn't paying attention like I used to. She blamed me for a choice that was hers alone. I listened. Every word. And I responded with the only thing I had left, dignity. I said I understood, that love sometimes dies in silence, that perhaps I, too, failed to recognize the signs. And I offered what was mine, forgiveness. Not because she deserved it, but because I deserved the peace of not carrying grudges. And that's when I decided to leave. She didn't believe me. She thought I'd never leave. That I was different, firm, too stable, to leave. But I left. In pain. In longing. In anger, yes. But I left. Because sometimes, loving yourself means knowing when to walk away. I started over from scratch. New home, new routines, new questions about myself. I rediscovered what I liked to do alone, what made me laugh, what gave me pleasure without needing to please anyone. And one day, without looking, I met someone. Someone who chooses me every day. Who doesn't need to hide their phone or give lame explanations. Who looks me in the eyes with truth. Who smiles without calculation. Who loves without reservations. Time passed. And she reappeared. With tired eyes, a low voice, and the same blouse she'd been wearing when we'd first met. She asked to talk. She said she didn't know what she'd lost until she saw me with someone else. That the other man wasn't what she expected. That she regretted it. That I even missed the smell of our sofa. I listened to everything. With respect. Because it still hurt to see her in that state. But also with the certainty that I wasn't the same anymore. I said I understood. That no one is immune to mistakes. But that my wound had healed from afar. That I was moving on in peace. And that peace sometimes comes with distance. She cried. She didn't beg. She just cried. And in her eyes, I saw for the first time the pain of someone who lost something they didn't know how to appreciate. It wasn't guilt. It was emptiness. That absence that remains when you understand that true love doesn't knock on the same door twice. And that day, she realized, she'd traded a home for empty promises. She'd been left with the leftovers of what she thought was a feast. And now, she looked from the outside in, wanting to return to a place that no longer existed. Today, I'm still with someone who chooses me even on the hard days. Who loves me through routine, through chaos, through boredom. And she carries a regret that has no cure. Because there are pains that don't kill, but leave the soul limping. There are mistakes that can't be fixed, only accepted. And there are loves that, once broken, never become whole again, they only become memories. But what did she really see, deep in my eyes, that last time we spoke? What made her understand, definitively, that she had lost me forever? This is something she will never forget. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal will never be romanticized, on the contrary, it is portrayed for what it truly is, a choice that hurts, destroys, and leaves deep scars. All stories are fictional, but the feelings are real. Our purpose is clear, to show, through intense narratives, how betrayal can change destinies and cause irreparable losses. Get ready. What you're about to hear is a story. Strong, exciting and shocking. A lesson in love, pain, and consequences. He met her on an ordinary late afternoon, the kind when the world seems to have forgotten to hurry. The sun fell lazily between the buildings and reflected in the glass windows of the cafe where he usually went after work. She arrived, laughing on her cell phone, distracted, as if there were nothing that day that could be more important than the conversation she was having. But he saw her. And in that moment, without her realizing it, his life began to change direction. It wasn't because of her beauty, although she had a charming presence, with an elegant simplicity that stood out even among so many people, it was because of the calm energy she carried, the carefree way she occupied the space. Their eyes met for a few seconds, long enough for time to seem to stretch just for them. She smiled without knowing exactly why, and he responded with the same restrained gesture of someone caught off guard by chance. And it was this chance that, days later, would repeat itself. She returned to the same cafe, at the same time. He did too. It wasn't planned. It just happened. And in that second silent encounter, they both understood that something wanted to happen. His name was Daniel, and he possessed a rare kind of kindness, the kind that isn't performative, expressed in simple gestures like pulling out a chair, paying attention to every word, remembering details people often forget. He worked as a financial analyst at an investment firm, a methodical, calm, and discreet man, but with a restless mind. He had always been passionate about old movies, had a vinyl record collection inherited from his grandfather, and cultivated a refined taste for small things, like the smell of freshly ground coffee or the sound of rain hitting the window. He was never much of a talker, but when he did, he said exactly what he felt. The kind of person who seemed made to be a foundation, a shelter. Her name was Laura. And Laura was movement. She had that sparkle in her eyes of a daydreamer, who sees poetry even in the rush of the world. She was an architect, specializing in commercial spaces, and lived in constant creation. She was intense, spoke with her hands, sped up when excited, and then laughed at herself like someone who knows it's hard to keep up with her own pace. She lived with packed schedules, projects delivered at the limit, but she always found time for friends, for family, to hear stories that weren't hers. Her greatest strength was also her weakness: she believed in people. She believed so much that sometimes she let herself be carried away by the versions others chose to present. The two became inseparable in less than 2 months. That connection, initially subtle, became routine. Dinners that started by chance and stretched into the wee hours, aimless walks around the city chatting about everything and nothing, shared music, series they watched together from a distance only to comment on later as if they were side by side. Laura pulled him toward the new, the spontaneous, the unexpected. Daniel offered grounding, direction, and comfortable silence. They were complementary opposites. She made him laugh out loud. He made her breathe deeply. With him, she could rest. With her, he could live outside the spreadsheet. And before they knew it, they were sharing the same apartment, learning to live with each other's flaws, making choices together, dreaming up plans with compound names and flexible dates. The first time they argued was over something small. A misunderstanding about a trip. He wanted something quiet, away from the hustle and bustle. She wanted to explore new cities, experience new things. They argued. But it was in that small crisis that they understood the value of balance. Neither of them gave in completely, but both gave in a little. And the trip happened, blending the new and the comfortable. They returned more connected than before. Little by little, they developed rituals: Sunday breakfasts, the habit of writing notes on the fridge, pizza nights on the couch. They lived as if they had found a safe island amidst the modern chaos. Friends said they were the right couple. That they fit together. That they complemented each other. And they believed it. But time, though silent, takes its toll. Over the years, dreams begin to take different forms. Daniel was promoted. He began working longer hours and getting involved in major projects. He wanted stability, comfort, and security. Laura, for her part, entered a frenetic creative phase. She participated in events, fairs, and exhibitions. She was invited to join a renowned architecture team that demanded more dedication, more visibility, and more social presence. Schedules began to diverge. Priorities did too. It wasn't abrupt. It began subtly. Dinners were cancelled, birthdays forgotten, conversations rushed. Each pulled in a different direction, unaware they were stretching the thread that bound them together. Despite that, they remained there. Present. Together. Laura still threw herself into his lap when she arrived tired. Daniel still made a point of having coffee ready when she woke up. But something had changed. And neither of them could explain what. Maybe it was just the weight of time. Maybe the sum of the little things. They still loved each other, or at least they believed they did. But love was no longer as light as before. It had become an effort. And while the effort was still worthwhile, it was starting to become routine. Laura began to participate in company events more frequently. She needed to show off, position herself, build an image. Daniel understood. But little by little, he was left out of these parts of her life. Not by direct decision, but by subtle exclusion. First, it was a launch cocktail party. Then a quick trip. Then a dinner with clients. He accepted. He supported. But he felt it. He felt it when she returned late and spoke little. When she seemed distant even lying next to him. He felt it, but he didn't confront her. Because trust had always been the foundation of their relationship. And he trusted. Sometimes out of love. Other times, out of fear of what he might discover if he didn't. As she grew professionally, he immersed himself more in her daily life. He took care of the house, organized the bills, and did the shopping. He began to notice how her spaces remained empty for longer. Her favorite clothes began to appear less frequently. Her perfume changed. The music she listened to in the shower changed. But even so, he continued. He prepared meals. He sent loving messages. He planned trips for them both. He tried, almost invisibly, to keep the flame of what they had built alive. Laura, for her part, seemed torn between two worlds, the new, exciting, and full of possibilities, and the old, familiar, safe, yet static. She still loved Daniel. But sometimes she missed being seen. Desired. Admired as before. And this need for validation began to weigh more heavily than it should. Their conversations became more practical. About bills, schedules, appointments. They rarely talked about feelings. When she arrived late, she'd simply say it was a long meeting. He didn't ask many questions. He just listened. And with each silence between one answer and the next, something inside him tightened a little more. He still remembered her laugh when they talked nonsense in the middle of the night. How she'd rest her head on his shoulder while they watched old movies. Now, the movies were half finished. The laughter was more restrained. And the hugs were increasingly rare. But he resisted. Because I believed it was all a phase. That true love survives wear and tear. That routines can be re-enchanted. Laura, on the other hand, no longer knew exactly what she felt. Whether it was exhaustion, emptiness, or simply longing for a version of herself that no longer existed there. When they were together, the silence began to scream. And when they were apart, sometimes, it even felt like a relief. A relief she herself couldn't explain. The house remained the same. The photos remained in the frames. The notes on the refrigerator had diminished, but still existed. To the outside world, the couple was the same. But inside, a silent abyss opened up. And no one spoke of it. Because naming the abyss would require courage. And both were too tired to confront what they might find on the other side. They continued on the autopilot of coexistence, like two strangers who remembered, every now and then, how good it was when they were still everything to each other. And it was in that space between the love that was and the love that tried to resist that history began to change. But neither realized that, sometimes, it's in that gap where ruin lies. Where the quietest choices are made. Where bonds, once firm, begin to unravel without fanfare. And when they realize it, it's already too late to tie up what time, little by little, has untied. Daniel began to notice that the silence was taking up more space than any conversation between them. The apartment remained tidy, tasks continued to be shared, commitments were being fulfilled, but there was a weight in the air, an unspoken absence that hung between them in every daily detail. Laura was spending more time away, saying they were unavoidable commitments, important meetings, strategic dinners. And he, most of the time, believed her. Not out of naivete, but out of the kind of faith born of sincere love, of someone who chooses not to doubt so as not to risk losing. Even so, deep down, something in Daniel began to change. It wasn't anger, it wasn't jealousy, it was a subtle, nagging intuition, as if a piece had been moved on the board of their life without him realizing it. The messages between them became shorter. The "I love you" that had once been spontaneous now seemed formal. When he asked how her day had been, he always heard the same answer, tiring, but everything's fine. It was as if she were always in a hurry, even when she was at home. And in the rare moments they sat together at the table, Laura seemed distant, fiddling with her phone, answering emails, her mind always elsewhere. Daniel didn't interrupt her. He just watched. Her eyes no longer sought his. Her attention, which had once been his, was now focused on something he couldn't name. One night, she arrived late for a dinner they'd arranged with a couple of friends. She said she'd been stuck in a meeting, but didn't elaborate. She looked too pretty for a typical day at the office, with elaborate makeup and a dress he'd never seen before. Daniel noticed but didn't comment. He sat next to her in the restaurant and tried his best to make the moment seem normal. But Laura was restless, fidgeting with her napkin, avoiding eye contact. She laughed exaggeratedly at jokes, but her eyes didn't smile. And as much as he tried to convince himself it was just stress, a part of Daniel felt something was off, an emotional distance that could no longer be ignored. Days later, when he arrived home early from work, he found the apartment empty. Laura had said she would work from home that day. The rooms were silent. On the table, a half-finished glass of wine. On the sofa, her blazer was tossed carelessly. Her cell phone wasn't on the charger, as usual. Daniel waited for hours. He called once. No answer. When she arrived, almost midnight, she explained that her boss had scheduled a last-minute dinner with the team and hadn't been able to tell him. Daniel looked into her eyes for several long seconds. And for the first time in years, he couldn't believe it. He began paying more attention to details. Not out of distrust, but for emotional survival. He noticed that Laura changed her clothes before going out, carrying a second set of clothes in her bag. That she answered calls in the hallway, speaking softly. That she started using a password on her cell phone, something she'd never done before. Dinners as a couple became avoided. Calls in the middle of the day became rare. And when they were together, it was as if there were an invisible barrier between them, an absent presence, a love that breathed through devices. One rainy morning, Daniel woke up to an empty bed. He went into the living room and found her sitting in the dark, staring out the window. He approached silently, touched her shoulder lightly, and asked if everything was okay. Laura took a few seconds to respond. She said she just couldn't sleep, that she had a lot on her mind, that she was tired. He offered her tea, but she declined. They sat side by side for a few minutes, without saying a word. Her breathing was labored, as if she were struggling to keep something inside. But she said nothing. Daniel respected the silence. It was the only gesture that still seemed appropriate. As the weeks passed, he began to find clothes he didn't recognize, perfumes that weren't hers, small details that didn't fit with the routine he knew so well. A ring forgotten on the nightstand. Makeup smeared after arriving home too late. There was always an explanation, but none of them seemed real. Until one day, while tidying the bookshelf drawers, he found a sealed envelope with her name handwritten on it. His heart beat faster. He didn't open it. He put it back. It was the kind of discovery that, once made, there was no turning back. But it confirmed what he feared most, there was something there he wasn't allowed to know. Still, Daniel insisted. He invited Laura out, trying to recreate moments that once made them happy. He proposed a short trip to relive the good old days. She declined, saying she didn't have time, that she couldn't take time off from the company. She tried to reschedule the date, citing commitments. Daniel pretended to understand, but deep down, he felt increasingly invisible in his own story. One weekend, while they were organizing the closet together, a necklace fell out of her coat pocket. It was delicate, the likes of which he'd never seen before. He asked casually, trying to hide his unease. Laura hesitated for seconds that felt like minutes, then replied that it was a gift from a friend, something old she'd found again. Daniel smiled awkwardly. He didn't press the issue. But that hesitation was enough to cut through him like a blade. Laura's body spoke louder than her words. And her body trembled. The following Monday, Laura announced that she was having a company gala dinner. She said everyone would be there, that it was important for her image. Daniel, as always, was supportive. He asked if she wanted him to go with her. She said no. That it would be better to maintain a more professional demeanor, that her boss had invited her to go together out of convenience and formality. She said it matter-of-factly, but Daniel understood the message. And in that moment, it wasn't what she said that hurt, it was what she chose not to say. On the night of the event, he prepared dinner anyway. He left the table set, the candles lit, the wine carefully chosen. She left first, in a hurry, wearing a new dress, high heels, and a sparkle in her eyes he hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't for him. When the door closed, Daniel stood there for a few minutes, staring at the doorknob as if it could undo everything. But she didn't return. And he, alone in that room, understood that her absence wasn't momentary. It was permanent. The hours dragged by. He waited. He watched the wine cool, the food lose its aroma, the candles melt until they went out on their own. He didn't call. He didn't text. He just waited. Like someone watching a dream crumble in silence. When she arrived, the clock was almost 3 in the morning. She was carrying her shoes, her eyes downcast, and the scent of a perfume she didn't wear when she was out with him. She tried to smile, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. She said it had been a long night, that the event was delayed, that the traffic was unbearable. Daniel just nodded. He said nothing. He went to sleep. The next morning, there was no good morning kiss. She left early, but he stayed. And that day, Daniel sat on the couch and stared into space. It was the end. There was no more room for doubt. Their love had been wounded by something unsaid, but felt in every gesture. And he, tired of waiting for explanations that would never come, began to withdraw into himself. Not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. And it was when he least expected it that confirmation arrived. A forgotten detail, a slip-up that could no longer be ignored. The betrayal, until then only intuited, now presented itself in all its rawness. There was no longer any doubt. She had crossed the line. And he, as much as he wanted to, could no longer pretend he didn't know. But what he didn't know yet, was that betrayal wasn't the worst thing in the story. What was about to come would change everything. Because the secret behind that abyss was deeper than he could ever imagine. Time passed with the weight of an unhealing silence. The confirmation of the betrayal was no longer news, but the pain that settled in Daniel was raw, burning, constant. He went through the days like someone surviving, fulfilling obligations, saying what was essential, trying to preserve what was left of himself in the face of a woman who now seemed a blurred reflection of the companion he had once chosen to share her life with. Laura followed her routines, acting as if nothing was out of place, though her eyes betrayed a growing discomfort, a restlessness she could no longer hide. Perhaps it was the weight of guilt, perhaps it was fear. But gradually, the atmosphere between them became unbearable. The cordial gestures became mechanical, the glances avoided, the conversations cold and functional. Daniel no longer sought answers. What he truly needed was release. It was on a cloudy Saturday, days after the gala dinner, that the tension that had built up between them finally boiled over. They were at home, each in a separate room, when Laura called him to talk. Her voice was low, slurred, as if she'd been rehearsing what she was going to say for days. Daniel entered the room slowly, sat across from her, waiting. Her heart was beating fast, her hands trembling in her lap. His gaze was calm but distant, as if he already knew what was coming would not be good. She began talking about the strain, about the distance that had grown between them, about how their paths had become different. Daniel listened silently, without interrupting. Laura tried to justify what had no justification, throwing out random sentences, trying to construct a narrative in which the betrayal was a consequence, not a choice. But he no longer reacted. It was no longer a surprise, it was simply confirmation. And then, she confessed. She said she'd gotten involved with someone else, that it was a mistake, that she hadn't intended it, that she'd let herself be carried away. The words fell like shards to the living room floor. And even though he already knew, hearing them from her mouth hurt in a different way. But he didn't scream. He didn't question them. He simply said, with a tone that mixed sadness and relief, that there was no longer anything to keep them there. She cried. She apologized. She said she still loved him, that she didn't know how they had gotten to this point. Daniel simply nodded, stood up, and said he needed some time. He left the house with firm steps, but inside, he carried a gaping abyss. He walked aimlessly, went to a nearby park, and sat on a bench, letting the cold wind wash away some of the weight he carried in his chest. There, among still trees and dry leaves, he understood that something inside him had died. Not love. But expectation. Hope. The illusion that it could still be saved. He decided he would start over. He looked for a new apartment and announced he would be leaving soon. There were no more arguments. Just a melancholic silence, the end of history. In the following days, he calmly organized his things, choosing what to take, what to leave, what to throw away. Meanwhile, Laura watched everything with moist eyes and an expression of someone who wanted to stop him but didn't know how. The day before the move, she asked to talk again. She said she needed to say something, that there was more. Daniel took a deep breath. He thought nothing could surprise him anymore. But then, she revealed the secret that would change everything. He said there was something he needed to know. That the betrayal, despite everything, wasn't what destroyed her most. That the real impact came later. And, with a choked voice, he explained that, weeks after she began her relationship with the other man, one random morning, she decided to stop by the cafe where she and Daniel had first met. She sat at the same table. Ordered the same coffee. She tried, for a few minutes, to relive that feeling of beginnings, of discovery. And it was there, at that very moment, that she saw something that shattered everything inside her. Across the room, through the rain-fogged window, she saw Daniel sitting with a woman. They weren't holding hands, nor was there any obvious physical contact. But there was one detail she knew all too well, the way he looked. That calm, focused, gentle gaze, with a light, sincere half-smile, the same one that had once been hers alone. He listened to the other woman intently, laughing spontaneously, touching her arm naturally. And in that moment, Laura understood what it meant to be replaced. Not by her body. But by her emotional space. By everything she herself had chosen to abandon. She stood there, motionless, watching the scene for a few minutes. The pain she felt wasn't jealousy. It was the recognition of what she'd lost. She said she ran out, got into her car, and cried like she'd never cried before. The betrayal she'd committed seemed small compared to the pain of seeing Daniel, silently, starting over. That someone was taking the place she'd destroyed. That the love she'd thought eternal had learned to go on alone. Laura confessed she tried to pretend she didn't care, that it was just wounded pride. But it wasn't. It was loss. And it was on that day that she truly understood what she'd done. Daniel listened to everything without interrupting. For the first time, he felt Laura was saying something from the heart. She didn't speak as if she wanted an apology. She spoke as if she was facing her own mistake, naked and irreversible. He asked why she never told him. She replied that she was afraid to show how much she had lost. That she preferred to appear strong rather than acknowledge that she had destroyed her own home. Daniel remained silent. And after a few seconds, he said there was no going back. That forgiveness existed, but love no longer lived there. Laura cried uncontrollably. She only asked him to understand. That he wouldn't hate her. That one day, if he looked back, he would know that, despite everything, she had loved him. But Daniel no longer wanted to carry the pain of trying to understand what no longer made sense. He had forgiven, yes. But he had healed far away. And in that moment, he understood he no longer needed justifications. What he needed was to close that door, without resentment, without hatred, but with the dignity of someone who knew how to leave before destroying himself. He stood up. He said he hoped she, too, would rebuild herself. That she would find what she was looking for. And he walked out of the room with calm steps, leaving behind not only a broken marriage, but also a part of him that no longer belonged to him. That same day, he met the woman with whom he had started something new. It wasn't a relationship yet. It was a beginning. But it was light, sincere, and honest. He told her everything. He said he needed time, but that he wanted, for the first time in a long time, to try to be happy again. She smiled, touched his hand, and said she was there. That she wasn't in a hurry. That the important thing was to be with someone who chooses truthfully. And there, amidst recognizable glances, Daniel understood that life goes on. That love isn't always eternal, but self-respect must be. That pain teaches. That abandonment hurts. But that a new beginning, when it arrives quietly, has the power to heal wounds that seemed incurable. And on the other side, in a silent room, Laura stared at her phone screen. She reviewed old photos. She replayed conversations in her head. She wondered where she'd lost herself. And deep down, I knew no answer would change what had already happened. Because some choices cost everything. And there are glances that, once averted, are never the same again. But there was one last time their paths would cross. And when that happened, she would see, with her own eyes, the most painful truth of all, that love, when it leaves silently, doesn't warn that it won't return. Without looking back, Daniel descended the building's 3 flights of stairs with firm, almost mechanical steps. His body seemed to act for him, while his mind still processed Laura's words, her eyes watering, her restless hands trying to touch what no longer belonged to him. The afternoon sky was beginning to close in with heavy clouds, and the cold wind carried with it what remained of a bygone era. As he exited the lobby, he took a deep breath, as if releasing a weight he'd carried for too long. It no longer hurt. Or maybe it did, but in a different way, like a wound that had stopped bleeding and become a scar. He walked for a few blocks, aimlessly, trying to clear his mind. He wanted silence. But not the silence of a home that was no longer home. He wanted the kind of silence that finds meaning, the kind that soothes, that reorganizes, that no longer needs to shout to be noticed. That same night, after a heartfelt conversation with the woman who had been growing closer to him in recent months, someone who knew him more from the present than from the remnants of the past, Daniel made the decision he had been pondering for weeks. He called a real estate agent, moved up, signed a temporary lease in another neighborhood, and began packing up what was left of the apartment. The clothes, the books, the paintings, everything was carefully separated. There was no longer any anger or anguish. Only the knowledge that he needed to go outside and breathe. As he packed his life, an old song played in the background. He didn't cry. He only smiled faintly at times, as if recognizing that he had been happy there, but that happiness no longer belonged to him. Across town, Laura faced the cruelest emptiness of her life. It wasn't physical loneliness, there were people around, concerned friends, invitations to go out, constant messages. But it was a loneliness of presence, of soul, of meaning. No connection filled the silence Daniel left behind. No face replaced the calm in his eyes. She tried to fill her time, dedicating herself to projects, immersing herself in tasks that required her attention, but her thoughts always returned to the same place, the last time he looked at her as if he had already broken inside. It was a look that hurt more than any scream. Because it carried the irreversible acceptance that there was no longer us. 2 weeks later, their paths crossed again, unexpectedly, in a small downtown coffee shop. Daniel was sitting at one of the tables in the back, a book in his hands and looking as relaxed as ever. He wasn't alone. The woman with him smiled lightly, and they both seemed completely at ease. Laura hurried in, talking on the phone, and only noticed him when she was a few steps away. Her heart raced, her fingers froze, and she instinctively looked away. But it was too late. Daniel had already spotted her. She hesitated, considered leaving, but then took a deep breath and approached. "Hi," he said, almost whispering. Daniel looked up, calmly closed his book, and smiled. A gentle, polite smile. The woman beside him looked at Laura neutrally, nodded, and discreetly stood up, heading toward the counter. Laura remained standing there, as if the floor were about to give way. He invited her to sit, as calmly as ever, as if offering a final gesture of peace. "Are you okay?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I am," he answered sincerely. "And you?" She hesitated, looking around as if seeking support from walls. "Trying," he said, with a sad laugh, "but I confess that it's been more difficult than I imagined." Daniel remained silent for a few seconds. There was no judgment in his gaze, but neither was there the warmth that had once welcomed her. "I know," he said finally, "it's not easy when we realize the size of what we've lost." Laura swallowed hard. That hurt, but it was true. "I saw you here once, with her," he confessed. "I couldn't get in. It was that day that I realized you were no longer mine." "I was never a possession, Laura," he replied softly but firmly. "I was with you. All the way. Until the last moment I was welcome." She nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I messed up, didn't I?" Daniel took a deep breath and rested his arms on the table. "I don't know if ruin is the right word. I think, you made choices. And every choice has a price. And sometimes it's too loud," he added, his voice breaking. "Yes," he replied, "sometimes we only understand when we can no longer go back." A thick silence fell between them. She looked at him as if begging for a chance she knows won't come. He looked at her as if respecting the pain of others, but having learned to respect his own peace. "Does she make you happy?" he asked, almost in a whisper. Daniel smiled slightly, not triumphantly, but serenely. "She chooses me every day. And that, after all, is what I value most today." Laura tried to smile, but couldn't. The tears flowed uncontrollably. He pulled out a napkin, handed it to her gently, and stood. The woman with him was already approaching, and he greeted her with a discreet kiss on the forehead. Laura waved goodbye. She left the cafe quickly, her face still wet, her chest aching. In the following days, she wrote a letter. Not with the intention of winning him back, but to somehow seal it away. She told him everything, the memories, the regrets, the small daily deaths of those who chose wrongly. She delivered it to the concierge of his new building, without any additional notes, without any formal signatures. Daniel read it that same day. He cried. Not from longing, but from liberation. Because, as he read each line, he was certain that everything he'd experienced was real, was beautiful, but that love, when left untended, dies, even if it's great. Months passed. Laura reinvented herself. She rediscovered herself in her own passions, in what she left behind when she lost herself. She never spoke to Daniel again. But sometimes, she saw him on social media, smiling in candid photos, in landscapes that once belonged to them both. It was a silent pain, but also a vivid reminder of what you lose when you betray not only another person, but yourself. Daniel continued his life alongside someone who knew how to love him without deviation, without question, without hesitation. He found not a substitute for the past, but a future that didn't need to be healed every day. And in each small, everyday choice, he found what had been most missing before, reciprocity. And so, between the goodbye that wasn't said aloud and the choices that cost them dearly, they both learned the hardest lesson of love, that when trust is destroyed, what's broken isn't just the relationship, it's the very place where one could return. And there are pains that time can soothe, but it never returns what the heart lost the very moment it was exchanged. Laura spent the following months living with a feeling that not even time could dilute, that of having been the author of her own demise. It was no longer a matter of longing, nor desire, but of a painful and irreversible awareness that everything she could have experienced with Daniel now belonged to a parallel reality where she was no longer welcome. The world around her continued to spin, the commitments, the deadlines, the new projects, but within her there was a constant pause, an interruption that repeated itself every time she remembered his gaze in that cafe, so serene, so free of her, as if the last traces of who she once was had dissolved there. She tried to carry on, it's true. She went out with friends, maintained a semblance of normality in front of her family, diligently cared for her image, perhaps in a desperate attempt not to appear broken. But there was a fracture. And this silent fracture manifested itself in the little things, in the way she took so long to respond to messages, in her indecision when faced with invitations, in the prolonged silences amidst trivial conversations. Laura was present in the world, but absent from herself. Daniel's days, on the other hand, continued with a different texture. There was a kind of peace he'd never experienced before, not because everything was perfect, but because there was now a lightness. He'd learned to recognize the signs, to respect his own limits, to appreciate the simplicity of gestures that had previously gone unnoticed. With his wife by his side, every little routine took on meaning, from the coffees prepared without having to ask to the spontaneous conversations about movies, fears, and memories. He wasn't searching for the past in her eyes, and that was the most liberating thing of all. It was a new beginning that didn't require rebuilding what had been destroyed, but rather the construction of something entirely new, based on truth, mutual admiration, and, above all, real presence. There were still marks of what he'd experienced with Laura, of course. No one emerges unscathed from a profound surrender. But those marks no longer hurt. They were part of who he'd become. And because of that, they were also part of the peace he now felt. The contrast between them was stark, but they both knew, in different ways, that it was fair. Laura understood, now clearly, that her greatest betrayal wasn't getting involved with another man. It was leaving Daniel emotionally alone for so long, while he was still struggling to hold together a relationship she had already let crumble internally. She recognized that the real betrayal began well before the kiss, the touch, the hidden messages. It began when she stopped listening, looking, choosing. And perhaps this was the greatest dilemma she carried, knowing that there wasn't a single moment of rupture, but a series of small, daily abandonments she pretended not to see. One afternoon, while visiting a mutual friend who was still in touch with Daniel, Laura overheard something that completely disarmed her. Commenting on an art exhibition he had visited with his new partner, her friend uttered a simple sentence: "He smiles like he hasn't smiled in a long time." Laura didn't react immediately, but she felt as if she'd been punched in the chest. Not out of jealousy, but because she realized that the laughter she'd so often wasted was now blossoming elsewhere. A place she could no longer reach. That haunted her for days. And for the first time, she began to wonder not about what she'd lost, but about who Daniel had become after her. Meanwhile, Daniel was doing something he hadn't been able to do for a long time: planning. Not just events, trips, or dinners, but life plans. He was thinking about changing careers, maybe even starting his own business. He felt strong enough to take risks again. No longer on impulse, but consciously. The presence of the woman walking beside him was calm, solid, and firm. She didn't demand to be the center of his life, but offered a genuine partnership. This enchanted him more than any fleeting passion could have. Ironically, a new twist was approaching. An urban restoration project involving several city companies brought together professionals from different fields. Laura, due to her experience, was invited to lead one of the architectural projects. Daniel, in turn, had been invited as a financial consultant for one of the sponsoring groups. When the names were announced, shock was inevitable. Both hesitated, but knew they couldn't refuse professionally. The city was big, but the market was small, and maintaining composure had become, more than ever, a matter of dignity. At the project's first official meeting, the two greeted each other politely. Their colleagues didn't notice any apparent discomfort. She wore a forced serenity. A maturity that surprised her. During the presentation of the project's goals, their eyes met only a few times. But during a pause, while waiting for coffee to be served, they were alone for a few minutes. It was Laura who struck up a conversation, with a shy lightness. She commented on the city, the unexpected heat that month, the hustle and bustle of the streets. Daniel responded naturally, but without opening up more space than necessary. Until she asked, almost in a tone of thinly veiled confession, if he still thought about her. Daniel didn't hesitate. He said he did. That certain people, even when they don't stay, leave permanent marks. That he remembered the good times, the trips, the Sundays on the couch, the long conversations about everything. But he also said, with the same calm, that he remembered even more the silence, the absence, the feeling of fighting alone for something they should have protected together. Laura listened without replying. She knew any attempt to soften the blow would be unfair. So she simply thanked him for being honest. And in that moment, she understood that he didn't hate her. Which, in a way, hurt even more. Because the opposite of love wasn't hate. It was the serene indifference that now existed between them. At the end of that week, Daniel received a message from her. A brief text, without drama, without demands. It simply said that she hoped he was truly happy. That he deserved to be chosen. That he deserved to smile without carrying any weight. He read it in silence, without responding. He kept the message, not out of attachment, but out of respect. And he moved on. He continued the project, stayed focused, returned home, and that night, beside the woman who was now part of his life, he recounted what he had experienced. She listened attentively, held his hand firmly, and said, "You're not there anymore. I see it in your eyes." Daniel smiled. And in that smile, there was truth. Laura, for her part, continued working on the project with dignity. She no longer tried to provoke meetings or create situations. She fulfilled her role efficiently, demonstrated competence, and maintained focus. There was a melancholy serenity about her, that of someone who had finally learned to live with the choices she had made. There were no more public laments or attempts at reconciliation. What she had was maturity. The same maturity that had been lacking when there was still time to save what had been lost. And that, in itself, was a kind of silent redemption. Both were finally at peace. But in different directions. And that was the cruelest part of the whole story, knowing that love existed, was real, was strong, but that, even so, it didn't survive. Because love is also caring. And once care is broken, love can even endure for a while, but one day it tires. And when it tires, it leaves. But there was still one last piece to fit together. One final gesture. One moment that would definitively define the end of this story. And when that moment arrived, neither of them was prepared for what it would bring. The weeks following Daniel and Laura's professional reunion were like a minefield of pent-up emotions. Both remained firm in their posture, respectful, polite, but behind every polite word lay a universe of memories that, though muffled, insisted on peeking to the surface. The urban project was progressing well, the team flowed harmoniously, and they both fulfilled their obligations masterfully. But deep down, each faced different dilemmas. Daniel felt increasingly whole, more centered in who he had become after the pain. Laura, on the other hand, experienced a kind of growth that only comes when one faces one's mistakes head-on, not with victimhood, but with awareness. She no longer expected anything from him, no longer harbored fantasies of a fresh start, but deep down, she longed for the chance to say goodbye to their story with dignity. She knew the final chapter had been written without her presence, and perhaps that was precisely what hurt most, the absence of a shared ending. Late on a rainy Friday afternoon, after the project's last in-person meeting, the team suggested an informal get-together at a nearby bar. Everyone was in high spirits, laughing, planning drinks and small celebrations. Laura hesitated. She considered refusing. But something inside her told her it might be important to go. Not for Daniel. But for her. For no longer running from the shadows, for allowing herself to exist in the same space where he was, without having to feign indifference, without trying to fix the irremediable. Daniel didn't resist either. When they invited her, he simply glanced quickly in her direction and, with a slight nod, confirmed his presence. Deep down, they both knew something needed to happen there. Not a return, not a repeated apology, but perhaps just a final moment of humanity between two people who loved each other deeply and were deeply hurt. The bar's atmosphere was welcoming, lit by amber pendant lights and soft music playing in the background. Conversations flowed in scattered groups, and gradually, colleagues said goodbye, thanking them for their work, promising to stay in touch. It was already evening when only 5 people remained at the table, including Daniel and Laura. The mood was light, but a subtle tension hung in the air. Laura realized she couldn't bear to leave without saying something, without at least acknowledging what was there between them, so unsaid and yet so present. She waited for the other 2 in the group to go to the bathroom, excused herself, got up, and went to the bar, where he was getting his second whiskey. "Do you have a minute?" he asked calmly. Daniel looked at her, took a slow sip, and nodded. They stepped outside, covered by an awning, where the rain pattered softly and steadily against the asphalt. The streetlights reflected off the puddles, and the sound of the water created a kind of complicit silence between them. Laura leaned against the exposed brick wall, crossed her arms, and took a few seconds before speaking. "I don't know exactly why I asked for this minute. Maybe I just want to end this properly, not between us," he corrected, "but inside me." Daniel didn't answer. He just looked at her intently. She continued, her voice unhurried but full of truth. "When everything happened, I spent a lot of time trying to convince myself that you were also to blame. That you let us grow cold, that you distanced yourself, that you didn't see me. But that was just my way of not facing the fact that I was the first to stop trying. I left the relationship long before my body left. I neglected it, pretended everything was fine, got used to being admired by others, and forgot the value of being loved in silence." She paused, discreetly wiping away a tear that was trying to escape. Daniel remained silent, but his eyes were attentive, present. "I saw you there, every day, trying. And yet, I chose the easy way out. I let myself be carried away by a glow that had no depth. And when I woke up, you were no longer there." Daniel took a deep breath, moved a little closer, and with a calm but firm tone of voice, answered. "You know what was hardest for me? It wasn't losing you. It was realizing that, even with everything we built, you didn't have the courage to look at me and tell me you wanted something else. You left in silence. And silence hurts more than any scream." She nodded, tears now streaming down her face without resistance. "I know. And you're right. I destroyed the place where we were safe. And the worst part is that now, after everything, I understand the value of that. But it doesn't make any difference anymore." Daniel took another step closer. "Not with anger. But with the calm of someone who has made peace with their past. It makes a difference to me. Knowing you understood. It doesn't change how I feel today, nor what I've built with someone else. But it gives me relief. Because I didn't leave hating you. I only left because I understood that continuing would be violating myself." The two stared at each other for a long time. The rain fell steadily, a background soundtrack to a silent goodbye. Laura leaned a little closer and, in a low voice, asked. "Do you forgive me?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked up, as if searching for words in the dark sky, and then turned his eyes back to her. "I forgave a long time ago. But forgiving isn't forgetting. And it's not always about making room again. Forgiveness was my final point." Laura closed her eyes for a moment, smiled sadly, and whispered, "Thank you." She knew she wouldn't hear more than that. And she didn't need to. That conversation was everything she'd been searching for since she saw the end in his eyes. Now she had received it. And even though it hurt in a lighter way. She could finally take a deep breath, turn her back, and walk to the taxi with a sense of closure. Daniel returned to the bar, sat next to the woman who was now a part of his life, and ordered another glass of wine. She noticed his distant look and asked if everything was okay. He said yes, that it was just the rain bringing back memories. And he smiled lightly. That night, they both slept with their hearts at peace. Not because everything was resolved, but because they accepted that some stories don't end with reunions and reconciliations, but with dignity and maturity. Life went on. And so did they. Each on different paths, with lessons they would never forget. But there was one last gesture. An encounter that was unplanned, but that would bring together past, present, and the definitive lesson on what it truly means to love, and, above all, to lose. It was on a sunny Sunday, months after that last conversation in the rain, that chance set the scene for the final chapter of their story. The park was full, families strolled with small children, couples sat on the grass exchanging hushed words, and the sound of children's laughter mingled with the soft birdsong. Daniel walked slowly along one of the trails, beside the woman who was now his daily choice, with whom he had built a serene relationship based on mutual trust, respect, and care. They both carried coffees, talked about a trip they planned for the next holiday, and laughed at small, insignificant things. It was a kind of silent happiness, without grand gestures, but full of meaning. He no longer carried weight, nor shadows. He knew that this peace was the result of everything he had decided to face head-on, of every pain he had chosen to transform into strength, of every goodbye he had learned to accept without begging for return. As they walked along the tree-lined path, a group of teenagers ran between the trails, and one of the boys, distracted, accidentally bumped into Daniel. The coffee cup fell, staining his shirt. The woman beside him rushed to help him clean it up, laughing at the situation. He returned her laughter with an affectionate look. And it was precisely at that moment, as he wiped his shirt with a napkin, that his eyes met Laura's once again. She was sitting alone on a wooden bench, a book open on her lap, but unable to read. Her eyes were fixed on him, transfixed. She wore simple clothing, her loose hair dancing in the light wind, and the expression on her face was that of someone who no longer expected to see her again. And perhaps because of that, he felt the impact of that spontaneous reunion even more deeply. Laura watched the scene for a few seconds, but it was enough time to take it all in. She saw the lightness of the touch, the genuine affection in the look Daniel gave that woman, the kind of look that had once been hers. There was no jealousy in that moment, nor any desire to interrupt or intervene. There was acceptance. A painful silence, but also liberating. She closed the book slowly, took a deep breath, and prepared to stand. But before she could discreetly move away, Daniel's companion saw her and, with a natural gesture, touched his arm, pointing in her direction. Daniel turned and, recognizing her, maintained his calm demeanor. He simply greeted her with a slight wave, wordless, without a hint of approaching. Laura returned a barely perceptible smile and, without hesitation, picked up her bag and left. That night, Daniel didn't comment on the encounter. He knew there was no need. It wasn't a secret, nor was it a hurt feeling. It was simply something resolved. Something that was part of his history, but no longer interfered with the present. The woman beside him knew him well enough to notice the unusual silence, but she didn't force a conversation. She simply held his hand while they watched a movie in the living room and dozed off on the couch, cuddling. That tranquility was something he never imagined he could feel again after being betrayed and destroyed from within. It was the certainty that love can be rebuilt, yes, but only when it's born from a new truth. Laura returned home that afternoon with a heavy heart. She looked in the mirror and recognized a more mature, more tired, but also more aware version of herself. She understood that there are loves we only appreciate when they can no longer be touched. That there are people who don't wait forever. That there are actions that are like mirrors, they reflect what we are in that moment, and sometimes, that reflection is too painful to accept. She wouldn't try to contact anyone anymore. She wouldn't write any more letters. She wouldn't search social media. Not out of pride, but out of dignity. She had learned, with all the tears she shed in silence, that regret without change heals nothing. And that Daniel had forgiven her, yes, but he had moved on with another life, another woman, another story. And she needed to do the same. In the following months, Laura did something she'd never truly done before. She dove into herself. She started therapy, reconnected with old friends, and revived hobbies she'd abandoned. She rediscovered the pleasure of being alone without feeling lonely. She understood that her worth didn't come from external validation, but from the peace she felt when her soul was aligned with her heart. She attended a professional event in another city, where she was invited to speak about sustainable projects, and received a standing ovation. For the first time, as she left the stage, she didn't feel like telling Daniel about it. And upon realizing this, she understood that she was finally free. Years later, in a small, cozy bookstore, while organizing a book signing for her first book on effective architecture and the relationship between spaces and emotions, she spotted an older couple with a toddler. The woman was smiling, sitting next to a man reading a book to the little girl. Laura stopped for a second. It was Daniel. He didn't see her. He was focused on the story he was telling the child who called him Daddy. The woman with him held a bag of children's books and, with her eyes, conveyed a calm, deep love. Laura smiled. Not bitterly, but gratefully. That he had found happiness. And that she, now, was whole enough to only wish him well. Back at the signing table, she wrote on a reader's copy, "Sometimes the end of a story is just the beginning of a reunion with ourselves." And she signed it with serenity. She was no longer the woman who ran from her own pain. She was someone who had lived, made mistakes, lost herself, but, above all, learned. Daniel, in turn, lived with the woman he chose with a pure heart. They had a daughter. And he made a point of being a present, sensitive, involved father. He taught his daughter about respect, truth, and, most importantly, the importance of never turning your back on someone you truly love. He never spoke ill of Laura, never harbored resentment. He simply let time put everything in its place. And it did. This story ends with two distinct but equally necessary destinies. A man who chose to heal and was able to rebuild his life with dignity. And a woman who had to face her own reflection to finally free herself. There was no fresh start for two. But there was, indeed, individual redemption. Because life, however hard it may be, always offers a chance for rebuilding, but only for those who have the courage to face the consequences of their own choices. And now tell me, what did you think of this story? Comment below. I want to hear your opinion. Have you ever experienced something similar or know someone who has? Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any more stories like this. Every week, a new realistic, profound, and emotional plot. And before you go, take this thought with you: betrayal doesn't just destroy the other person, it destroys love, trust, home, plans. It turns promises into silence, turns laughter into memories. To betray is to lose more than you can imagine. It's to trade what's certain for emptiness. What's true for the moment. And there's not always time to go back. This channel does not support any kind of betrayal. Here, we show the consequences. Because the truth is simple: those who love, care. Those who choose, stay. And those who betray, lose.